All fall into this trap every January, and I know there's going to be other sessions in this series on things like exercise and getting active, but we all start out in January saying, right, that's it now, no more treats for me, I'm going to be really good, salads every night, I'm going to go out for my 5-mile walk. And what we're really doing there is setting ourselves up for a big fall pretty soon. Whereas if we could set ourselves smaller goals, which might feel a bit at the start saying, sure, what's the point in that, where is that going to get me? If we said, 20-minute walk 3 nights a week, we're much more likely in that situation to make steady progress, to feel less overwhelmed, and to actually move along. So that picture here of the person, the 2 ladders, and you see the person who's got the biggest step at the start isn't making the progress of the person who's chipping away at it. And that idea of not underestimating the power of small steps is really important across all areas of our lives. So the exercise one, so the last couple of days the weather's been fairly shocking, and we might have maybe had 10 or 15 minutes that are dry. We might have said, sure, what's the point in going out for 10 or 15 minutes? There's a big point in it. It's really important, and it's a good start, and we can build on it. Or if you're a parent and you're thinking of self-care and you're remembering when you were in your 20s and you could watch a DVD and read a book and go off and do whatever you wanted, and you're thinking, well, what's the point in sitting down and relaxing for 10 minutes? That's not going to do me much good. All the research would show that what we call micro breaks, small breaks, are really, really important for us, and they replenish and refresh us. So if you're trying to make some positive changes in your life, whether it's starting exercise, whether it's making some time for yourself, whether it's starting a new hobby, give yourself a realistic goal and don't underestimate the power of small steps. The final tip that I want to focus on, and this I suppose is particularly relevant to COVID-19, but it's quite relevant to our lives in general. What I'm encountering a lot in my work at the moment, I'm working with people on the phones quite a bit, and people are very angry about what other people are or aren't doing in relation to COVID-19. So people will say, well, I was down in Tesco last week and this woman had no mask on and she picked up the bananas and she put them back, and then she picked another bunch up and she was coughing, and I really felt like saying something to her. And again, obviously you'd acknowledge that that's something that's frustrating for you, but it's really important to focus on what it is you can actually control yourself. So if you look at the diagram there, the outer circle is all the things at the moment that really might be, we might be struggling with, and that's okay, and that's important to acknowledge. We might be wondering, how long is this going to last? What's the effect on the economy? We might be tuning in, a couple of times a day to see what NPHET are saying. We might be very frustrated because the neighbours had a party over Christmas and there was people coming and going. But there's very little that we can do to actually control or change that. Whereas if we look at the inner circle, the things that we have direct control of, so we can take a break from the news and social media, and time and again in different crises over the years, be they things like the Boston Marathon bombing or 9/11, the research has shown people who were checking news excessively did worse in terms of their mental health afterwards. So absolutely being informed, but not being overwhelmed. We can control whether we ask for help or not. So putting our hand up and saying, look, I'm under pressure here, I'm struggling. We can control staying in touch with people, eating well, doing the things we're supposed to be doing ourselves. So the hand washing, the face masks, our own routine. So absolutely acknowledging the outside stuff and the frustration that it brings us, but focusing the bulk of our time and our energy on the stuff that we can control ourselves. So just want to point you in the direction of a couple of resources. So Daniel mentioned a course called Stress Control. So this is a 6-week course, which we would typically run out in the community, either with the GA or, in hotels or community centres with the community workers. It's an excellent course. It always goes down really, really well. Very practical, looking at things like sleep, panic attack, relaxation. And unfortunately, because of COVID, it's had to move online. So a new course started the 11th of January, and there'll be another one starting in February and another one in March. So if you log on to stresscontrol.ie, the dates, all the details and the booklets and relaxation exercises that go along with the course are available. Ella mentioned, excuse me, a program called Your Good Self. So it's a program that we've developed in conjunction with the Cork City and County Libraries. And basically it's a list of resources on mental health topics, from bullying to stress to parenting, for all ages. There's books for kids as well, books for older adults, books for carers. And these are books that have been reviewed and recommended by HSE psychologists. So we all know, if we're looking for information, we might go to Google and we might in a few clicks find ourselves at some not very reliable information. So we would look at the resources that we use in our work and the ones that have good research and evidence behind them, and then the library stock those books for us. And we also recommend websites and apps as well. So the link is there for that. And some of these titles are available online via BorrowBox via your library at the moment. Then on the Cork Kerry Community Healthcare channel, Ella's already mentioned 5 Ways in 5 Days. So that's a series of videos by HSE psychologists, including Daniel, Ella and Judy, about the emotional impact of COVID-19. They're nice short videos and they give some advice for different topics. Then there's also a series of videos called Minding Yourself, which include things like desk stretches. So we're all spending a lot of time sitting down and on the laptops. There's also mindfulness sessions. And then finally, there is a course called Minding Your Wellbeing, which is a series of videos, again, coming out of the Health and Wellbeing department in the HSE on topics such as self-care and resilience. Then there's 3 other resources, one called Face COVID by an Australian psychologist called Rusk Harris. So really, really practical things about dealing with COVID. A really good website called compassionatewellbeing.com. And then finally, a US firm called wavecrestfilms.com have a really nice video called Surfing Corona, which is different therapists and psychologists talking about the early stages of coronavirus and their experiences and what they found helpful to cope, but it still holds true today. So I'll hand you back to Daniel, and I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Rosarie, for the presentation, and just to remind you in relation to the chat function, if you want to put any of your questions for any of us into the chat, we're happy to kind of address those at the end of the presentations. So our final speaker tonight is Judy Wall. Judy is a clinical psychologist and she works in the older adult service here in St. Finbarr's in Cork. So again, Judy has amassed a huge wealth of experience both in London working as a psychologist and also here in Ireland. She has a particular interest, I suppose, in compassion-focused therapy and mindfulness, and has developed a number of programs working with family members of older adults and supporting older adults in terms of addressing mental health needs. So over to yourself, Judy.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And thanks to everybody who's joined. I know older adults weren't mentioned specifically in the billing, so people may not have been thinking it would be included, but I suppose as we're covering, as Daniel said, cradle to grave, it's important to think across the whole lifespan. So just to echo what Rosarie was saying, and maybe some even of what Ella was saying as well, mental health exists, you know, really throughout the lifespan. So I've just got a photograph there of 4 generations of women, really just to make that point that just as we have our physical health, the body we occupy, we also have mental health as well. And it's something that I suppose a lot of older people maybe grew up at a time when it wasn't something people thought much about. But you know, it's something that is part of us throughout the lifespan. So all the difficulties, all the struggles that Rosarie mentioned and that Ella mentioned in relation to mental health, those are true, you know, really across the lifespan. So any of those things can occur at any stage of life. But I suppose there are a number of additional challenges that older people particularly might experience. And one is that of adjustment. There can often be a lot of changes that people are having to face at a stage of life where people maybe physically aren't as robust as they had been earlier in their life. So, you know, retirement is an obvious one, and that can be a mixed blessing. For some people, they're, you know, counting down the days, and for other people it can feel like a huge loss. So it's very individual, but it is nonetheless, it's an adjustment, it's a change for people. Rosari mentioned bereavement, and unfortunately, one of the, I suppose, occupational hazards of being, you know, 70 something or 80 something or even 90 something is that you will have outlived a lot of people that you've known. You'll certainly have outlived probably your parents, maybe a partner, siblings, children, be they as children or as adults, friends, neighbours, and so on. So bereavement is a sort of ever-present theme for a lot of older people. And I suppose linked with that, you know, that really comes under the umbrella of loss. And for older people, the bereavements can be things like, I suppose, you know, the loss of youth, of levels of energy, of mobility is a huge issue with older people. So, you know, there can be lots of physical changes that can really impact on people's lives. And I would say in my experience working with older people that, you know, age really is just a number. It's much more about the person's state of physical health. So you could have a very fit, active, healthy 82-year-old, and you could have somebody who's, you know, 15 years their junior, who's had a stroke, who suffers from diabetes, or, you know, who maybe has a chronic lung condition that requires them to use oxygen, that limits their mobility, their capacity to get out of the house. So it's not just about the number. A huge amount depends on the state of a person's health, physical health, and that in turn has a big impact on people's mental health. And there's a, you know, geriatrician I know, and he would say it's much harder to generalize from one 80-year-old to another. So, you know, if you've met one 80-year-old, you've met one 80-year-old, whereas a lot of 18-year-olds in terms of their life, it's much more similar, you know, whereas people, there's such a diversity in terms of people's physical health, and that can really make such a difference. One of the other really common problems that we see, and won't be a surprise to anybody on the call, I'm sure, is dementia. And that really is the umbrella term for a number of different conditions, Alzheimer's disease being the one that probably most people have heard of and would be familiar with. But there are other types of dementias as well. Some people may have heard of people having strokes. And as well as affecting people physically, that can affect, because it's affecting the brain, so it can affect people's things like their memory, their ability to speak, to organize themselves, to plan their day, to understand what's being said, to manage emotions. So there's the whole range of dementias that are something that, you know, is a very common problem that we would see as well. Sometimes people ask, you know, gosh, you know, there seems to be so many more people with Alzheimer's nowadays. Has it become more common? And I suppose the answer is yes, it has. But the main reason it's become more common is because more people are living for longer. So it's not that it's you're more likely to get it now than in the past. It's just that more people are living longer, and that's the big risk factor for developing dementia and Alzheimer's. Working with older people, very like working with children and babies and adolescents, very much seeing people in the context of the family. So we're always very mindful of carers as well. We would rarely see people in isolation. People are often, maybe it's a family member would come with them or be the person who raised a concern about the mental health problem. So carers and working with carers, supporting carers is very much part of the service that we would offer as well. So just this next slide, I suppose, is just kind of, it's a little bit of a summary of what I was saying. And if we just think of the person as in the middle of the three circles there, so particularly when we're thinking about older people, we really have to keep, as well as the person's mental health in mind, we have to keep their physical health in mind, and we have to keep their brain health in mind. And it's one of the things I really, really enjoy about working with older people is that we cannot ignore the body. And just all the sort of challenges that can bring as well. So in relation to, I suppose, just a few tips for people. And the first is just, it's a saying, if it's good for the body, it's good for the mind and brain. And that's particularly true in later life. So physical exercise for all the reasons to do with mental health, and I suppose maintaining fitness and physical well-being is really, really essential. And just as Rosario said, it's small incremental steps, no pun intended. It doesn't have to be anything big. And there's huge power in people's legs. And I've on the page with resources, there's a link there to a really interesting TED talk given by a geriatrician in London a number of years ago, which has done some research looking at, what's the difference. They've used some twin studies, and, why is it that some people remain fit and well and have good memory and good, I suppose, brain power in later life, and others less so. And there was a huge link between people who were physically active and had physically strong legs and good brains. Now, it won't protect everybody, and some people are going to just get it. There's a bit of the roll of the dice, but it's really important when people are older to remain active, to remain physically fit, and to keep moving, literally. Heart health is really important as well. Things like, regular checks of blood pressure, cholesterol, because it's just such a link. If things are good for your heart, they're good for your brain as well. And that's going to have a very positive impact on people's mental health. The importance of eating well, getting enough fluids. As we get older, we are less inclined to notice that we're thirsty. And a lot of carers will say they find it really difficult to encourage their older relative to take fluids. Now, we all go around these days with our bottles of water, and, an older generation didn't do that, but a cup of tea is fluid as well. So it doesn't have to be the bottle of water. It's just any fluids. It's really important to keep people hydrated. And a bit like at the start of the lifespan, small babies, if they get dehydrated, can get very sick very quickly. And the same is true for people at the later end of the lifespan. I've just mentioned alcohol there, just to flag it. I suppose it's not good for people in excess quantities at any stage of life, but just a cautionary note that as people get older, even what are deemed the safe alcohol limits are based on fit, healthy, younger adults. And many, many people that we would see in our service are on medication for, be it cholesterol, blood pressure, maybe some medication around arthritis. And, all the guidance around alcohol was never intended for people who were also taking a cocktail of medications and maybe antidepressants as well. And of course, we know that alcohol is a depressant, so it's going to interfere with the positive benefits of antidepressant medication, and it's not going to do somebody's brain any favors, particularly if they're beginning to develop any kind of memory problems. And just as Rosario said, small changes can go a long way. The next slide is it's about linking with the 5 ideas that Daniel said initially about connecting, about learning and so on, but the importance of doing things that give you joy. And people will often say, if they're worried about their memory, maybe should I do crossword puzzles? Should I do Sudoku? Should I learn a language? And yes, learning is important, but it needs to be something that you're interested in and that's going to give you joy. So if somebody's done crosswords all their lives and they love them, by all means continue. But if it just wasn't ever your thing, and it feels like it's a chore, then I would say, if joining a choir and singing is what gives you joy, there's a huge growing body of evidence that music and singing can have a really positive impact on people's mental health and on people's brain health when they get older. So it's finding whatever it is, be it connecting with other people, or the lady there who's doing her painting, who really is, I suppose it's an example of a mindful activity where it looks like she's really in the moment, really immersed in the activity, and finding joy from that. And that's really important for people. It's also important too, at all stages of life, we need to have a feeling that we're, I suppose, to give us our sense of self-worth and self-confidence, to feel that we are contributing something, or that, we have a value. And you'll see that with small children playing, where they're maybe minding their dolls or they're feeding people. So that sense of wanting to have a purpose, remains with us throughout the lifespan. And for most of our adult life, we have lots of opportunities, if we're in the workforce or you're parenting, to do that. Post-retirement, some people can feel a bit on the scrap heap, can feel a bit useless. And particularly if people have some degree of cognitive decline, if they're in maybe the early stages of a dementia, but they have the awareness that that's the case, feelings of usefulness or uselessness can be a really big issue, and can really kind of tip people into a depression. So doing something that gives you a sense of satisfaction, a sense of achievement, is really important. And again, it's, within your capabilities, within the current restrictions as well now, obviously. But it's finding that thing and the sense of satisfaction. I don't have up there the slide, but I was thinking actually afterwards, if people remember that man who was over 100 in the first lockdown in the UK, if people remember that man who walked around the complex where he was living. He was an elderly man with all his war medals on. I think his name was Moore, was his surname. But, he'd set himself a target, he'd set himself a goal, and, it just gathered such interest and momentum. And just the sense of satisfaction that people will get from being able to, this gentleman here, to be able to get outside, to be able to walk independently, that has such a positive effect on people's mental health. And the third one there is that all important staying connected, and that's obviously more challenging for people now than it would have been. And whether that's on the phone or via Zoom or WhatsApp video call, or in the case over here through the window, or meeting somebody in a social distance way in the park. So important for people to stay connected. We are social beings by nature, and those connections are really important and have such a beneficial effect on our mental health. And I suppose just to say, particularly too, if people have any degree of brain changes where they are developing a dementia, those connections are really important as well, because people are, maybe they're talking, people often become quite quiet and withdraw into themselves, particularly if they're conscious of the fact that their memory isn't as good. They can get very much lost if there's a whole group of people talking. But, the one-to-one conversation, it's giving the person a chance to interact, to use their language skills. So, it has a positive effect on their mental health, their mood, but also their brain, because they're using the skills that they have while they can. So this last slide here is really just, it's kind of bringing that together, that, by doing things that give us a sense of pleasure, joy, sense of achievement or satisfaction, and the really important piece, the social connection, that these things really do feed our well-being at any stage of life. But I suppose I'm thinking particularly about older people. And then just finally, the resources. There's a really good website that sort of really tried to bring together the National Dementia Strategy, devised this a few years ago, the Understand Together, and they have a public ad campaign. You've probably heard ads on the radio and TV around understanding dementia, and it's a really good website for putting together resources around that. The Freedom films are a really nice, easy to understand way of getting a sense of what dementia is, how it affects people, and they're done as animated films, quite short, so they're very easy to watch and could be watched by people at any stage of life. The 5 ways we've all referenced, you can have a look at that. And then there's that TED talk I mentioned, looking at the importance of physical activity on people's brain health. And I suppose, just because I'm conscious that a lot of older people that we are connected with in our service are not tech savvy and they're not on the internet, not to underestimate the importance of the good old fashioned telephone as a way of connecting and people staying in touch. And there's a marvellous service provided by Cork Friendly Call, where they will link in with somebody. There's a referral process, but they will link in particularly with people who are living alone. It is within the city area, so apologies to people who are on the call from further afield. But I know a number of people who really enjoy, really look forward to that weekly call. It's usually the same person will call them week on week, so people have had a chance to build up a relationship with that person. And particularly for people now who are having to stay at home, maybe self-isolate, those kinds of contacts can be really important, and it's gives meaning to the day for somebody. Okay, that's my lot. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Judy, for that. So we're into the final part of our session tonight, and I suppose this is an important piece where people get to ask some questions. I see that some things have come through there on the chat. Claire, do you want to chime in there and ask the question of the...
Yeah, so there was just two questions that I can see currently on the chat. And the first one was directed at Ella. So it's just with regards, is there a daily time frame for using social media, PlayStations, those type of things at home at the moment, to try and encourage, I suppose in terms of kids being at home and being homeschooled, or is interacting with their friends enough? I suppose, is there any guidelines around that? I think what the question was. For Ella.
Well, I don't usually give timelines to parents, because every parent has different idea about it, and every household is different. But I mean, the general thinking is that the younger the child, the less the screen time. I suppose, look, a lot of children are on screens at the moment because they have to be, because some of the schooling is coming through them, and they, the teens are on screens, either on the phone or playing the games. But is the question how much screen time, or is it that the socialization through screen time?
I think it's to do with the daily time frame for using screen time. Or, so that possibly versus the interaction of friends, which I don't think, obviously, it can never replace that. But just a daily time frame for it, I think,
Like I don't ever really give, this many hours for this age. I don't, because every family is different and people have different limits around it.
I think there the question as well, Ella, was, should there be some flexibility given the current situation where, you've got maybe kids that are trying to connect socially with their friends, and maybe parents are required to stretch their limits in terms of what they allow, so that their younger folk can stay connected. So it's your views on that, I think, really was...
Okay. Yeah. And I agree. I think because the younger people aren't able to connect face to face necessarily, that if they are able to do that online, on the FIFA or on the Fortnite or whatever it is, that I do think you have to give a bit of leeway at this moment in time around that, because that is possibly their one and only time to connect with the friends in a group kind of a situation. And they can have great fun on it. But look, they still have to get their proper night's sleep, especially now again, since they're back in the school routine. And they need their break. They need their breaks away from the screen as well, because no more than ourselves, you'd be a bit goggledy-eyed looking at the screen all day. So you have to have your break from it as well. But everybody's different, so... But flexibility is key, and balance is key.
Okay, thanks, Ella. So Claire, the next question there, and then there was a couple of other questions I have here as well, just for the panel, in case people wanted.
So the next question, I think, is something that I had kind of on my mind as well throughout the discussion, both from a personal and professional side of things as well, and even the people that we interact with work. But one of the participants has a 2 and a 4.5-year-old, 2 girls. But the 4.5-year-old is in particular is very emotional and missing obviously people, friends, a family circle. And while the obviously the parent is kind of telling her, you know, that we're all missing people and it's okay to be sad, I suppose, you know, is there any tips on how to address that situation? I think it's something I think we all face as adults and as kids, but I suppose, is there any tips? Again, it's directed at Ella in that situation and how to address that, particularly obviously for that age, 4.5.
Yeah. Well, like, you're already doing the first thing that I would say, and it's to validate that, yeah, of course you miss your friends. This is a tough time we're going through, and help them to understand, you know, try and make sure that they can understand why that is happening, that, you know, that it's not a punishment, but to keep us safe. And then the second way, I guess, is to try and maybe help think about how they might connect with their friends in a different way, and family. And that could be through social media, or it could be drawing a card or making a card to send to granny or to send to their friends. I know my own teenage daughter, this week she said she was expecting a letter in the post from her friend, and the excitement when it arrived in the post was unreal. And I just thought, isn't it great? Like, we're going back to the old ways of communication where you had to wait a day or two to get something in the post. But there was huge excitement, and it made me think of, you know, if we encouraged our children who might be feeling that isolation and the pain of being separated from friends and family, that's a lovely way to connect, maybe to paint a picture and send it to your friend, or to write a little, like the parent maybe helping them to write a little note about what they did that day and send it off, and then the friend's mother or father might help them to respond, and they might get a little correspondence going, and, you know, a bit of a connection, really. So it's how to foster those connections and those relationships when we can't physically meet, but we can hold each other in mind, and we can be excited about hearing from them. And it could be down to organising a little Zoom call as well. I mean, the parents to get a few little pals on the phone together. I mean, it could be very short because the attention spans mightn't be great, but you know, they appreciate it.
Okay. Just is there any other questions, Claire, coming up in the chat there? I can see it.
There's just two other ones that I can see here. So one is just directed, I suppose we're all devils for it at the moment, personally and professionally, but with regards time on our phone, I know there's a few things in terms of how long we should spend, and obviously it's good to disconnect from all social media and your phone for physical and mental health, but like, what is, I suppose, the threshold of the time you should be spending on your phone? I think you can actually do that on your phone as well in terms of how long that it's active for, but I suppose that's a general question really in terms of what is the threshold that we should be spending on our mobile devices.
So I'm not sure if there's, and others might chip in this, but I'm not sure if there's kind of a threshold. Like, certainly there is research to say that, you know, when we're looking at screens for too long, it kind of stimulates brain activity, and it does interrupt our kind of you know, sleep patterns and so forth. So it would be more guidance around how you use screens and where you use screens, I think, are important. At the moment, there's a tendency, I suppose, because many people are working from home and are on screens, they're literally coming off a screen from work and going onto their phone and streaming things, and then watching Netflix, and then checking their phone before bed. So the amount of screen time, you know, is massive, and we often just think of screens as like our phone, but obviously we're using screens with TVs and other things as well. And it's just the colors and the pixels and so forth. It's all stimulants, and that's exhausting. So you hear people talking about being exhausted from having to do Zoom calls, etc. So I think we really just need to think about having screen breaks. I think it's really important that you don't, you know, make an effort to have spaces where there is no screen. So like your bedroom, shouldn't be a place where you're using a screen. You shouldn't have the phones in the bedrooms. That would be true, obviously, for young people and for adults, so that you actually associate your room with sleep and your brain switching off, not switching on, which of course it is if you're connected to screens all the time. So I don't know if anybody else wanted to chime in on that.
I think another question to ask yourself is what am I not doing when I'm on a screen? So I've done my work screen time and I've checked a little bit, and then what else could I be doing with that time? So could it, be doing something in the house, spending time with family, going outside into the back garden for a bit of fresh air? So I think it's to look at what you're not doing when you're on a screen as well is a good way to kind of point you in a direction. I just wanted to quickly say about the 4.5-year-old, that rang a bell with me because my daughter is quite close in age and she hates Zoom calls and she hates video calls. So if auntie or granny wants to talk to her, she's sliding on the seat and she's running away, and but she still says she misses them. So what we've started to do, just like Ella said, is keep it really short and simple, and we also have something specific that we're doing on the call. So she makes a quiz for Nana and Grandad about Disney characters, which they sometimes need some help with, or she gives my sister, her aunt, homework to do, or we pick a book and we read it for 2 or 3 minutes. So it's something quite specific that has a start and a finish, and it's not adults peering at her going, is she there? Is she coming back? She's shy, or whatever, So we found that shorter and specific is helpful on the social media and the video calls with family.
Okay, great. So just as a general, and again, maybe for the whole panel and maybe of interest to people on the call. So like if you are concerned yourself about your mental health or somebody's mental health, like where should you start? If you're concerned about your mental health or well-being, where would you start if you needed to talk to somebody? Any guidance or suggestions?
The GP is always a good place to start, your local GP. I guess at the moment it probably might be more of a phone call than a visit, but if you're not sure what the support services are in your area, the GP will know. hse.ie or mentalhealth.ie, and they'll guide you towards online resources, books, and what's available in your local area. Public health nurses as well will know a lot of links in areas, community workers. So I would say definitely the GP, HSE website and your mentalhealth.ie are some good places to start.
Okay, and if you were concerned about maybe somebody in your circle, so it's not you, but it's somebody else, what are the kinds of things maybe that you should look out for, or how would you approach somebody if you were concerned about their mental health or well-being and you wanted to address that? And again, bearing in mind what we talked about at the start, which is that kind of stigma piece and us almost being afraid to name what we see. Any thoughts on that?
I suppose I could just speak in relation to older people, Daniel. Often we find in our service that it's somebody else in the family system has initiated the referral rather than the older person themselves. And that's very often the case if the person has maybe some degree of changes with their kind of brain function, with their memory and so on, because often the person isn't as aware of that maybe as people around them. But that's true with mental health as well, is that maybe it might be more apparent to other people. And I think the stigma piece is, and fear, it's kind of fear of the unknown is often a barrier for people accessing services. So I'd just echo what Rosari said, the GP is often a very good starting point, and given that most people already have a relationship with their GP and have been to their GP for many other reasons, it is a good starting point. And I think the research would show that, isn't it something like 4 out of 10 GP consultations are around mental health anyway. So if, even though the person might turn up and talk about something else, once they're there, hopefully they would be able to actually mention whatever the concern is and be signposted to support or services from there if it was needed.
Somebody was saying there on the chat as well, just ask your friend how are they feeling.
Yeah. I think that is kind of that is kind of the basics that I think for lots of people, and I hear this quite a lot, that lots of people are afraid that if I ask, then what if I hear something and I don't know what the right thing is to say and I make it worse? You know, at least if you say it, it's kind of acknowledging and validating that you've seen that the person is struggling. And it's not that we individually need to take responsibility to fix it, but it is that the piece about you supporting the person in accessing help if required, and it might mean even helping and encouraging the person to make the call to the GP or to reach out for professional help if needed is important. So that asking, and if you see something, to not be afraid to ask the question is really important, I think. So that's a good point. Okay, are there any other questions that people want to ask?
There's just one more in the chat, Daniel, from Sinead.
Just with the, that's what I'm just wondering, with the 5 ways to well-being that you spoke about, I'm just wondering with COVID, is it restricting elderly people from, or is it making them feel unconnected and obviously restricting their ability to get exercise, and and is there research to show that this, like, we know it's happening, but is there research to prove to us that it's happening, I suppose, is what I'm asking. In the sense that I'd like to know, is it affecting a lot of elderly people or just a small portion?
So Judy, you're probably best placed to.
In our service, Sinead, what we have found in over the last 10 months is that there certainly are a number of people presenting with mental health problems who never had contact with services throughout their adult life or until this time. So COVID has been a stressor and a kind of a tipping point, unfortunately, for some people. Now we haven't researched it. Actually, there is a trainee clinical psychologist who is doing her research thesis on the very subject of the impact of COVID on older people, but that's a work in progress, so can't report on that yet. But what we have found, I suppose, just in our service, is that typically it's been the more, people who've been more active and more, I suppose, connected with people outside of their home, that the kind of the fit, well older people seem to have been more adversely affected in terms of their mental health than maybe the kind of frailer older people. And I suppose there's kind of, in a way, there's obvious enough reasons for that, because the people who are fit and active, and maybe, I can think of a lady who was, maybe playing bowls regularly, or people who are going out to play cards, play bridge, play pitch and putt, all of that has stopped. And particularly if you were someone who lived alone and your social connections were through those activities and they have now ceased, that would have a much more serious impact on your life than somebody who's maybe housebound, who still has their, their daughter or their daughter-in-law coming in, bringing in a dinner, or they've got the public health nurse coming to dress the ulcer on their leg, or they're having to go somewhere to attend services. And in the process of doing that, they are still being afforded, I suppose, the kind of social opportunities and social connections. So it does seem to have more negatively impacted on the physically fit, well, previously active older people than maybe the kind of frailer older people. But that's just from what we've seen in our service.
Okay. That's what I would have seen myself, but I was just wondering, were they actually reaching out for help? So it's good that they are.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Albeit that some people are, I suppose, in acute distress by the time they have reached the service.
Okay, and I think that's probably a good point again to kind of just mention what's on the screen there about kind of needing to talk, and just reminding people, that if you're unsure about somebody's well-being, to encourage them maybe to talk to somebody. And these are some numbers that might be of use if the person can't speak to their GP or doesn't want to speak to you. Just making sure that people are aware of these numbers and that you have those numbers that you can share with people if you're concerned.
I think for me, what stands out is the the way it was presented and targeting the 3 groups who, through our work in the sports partnership, is, you know, who we work with as well in terms of young people, in terms of adults, adolescents and older adults as well. So it was a really good presentation with some really good tips, and very simple tips that is what we want to get out of this series in terms of the getting active, keeping well. Just in terms of the other supports that we have, I think Owen is just sharing it there on the screen, and you know, it kind of links back to a number of different topics he covered in terms of the 5 ways and connecting and being active. And I suppose that's kind of where we come in. And there's a number of supports and programs that we're running at the moment. And we're not going to underestimate how important it is to be active for people's mental health, but there's no way we'd have been able to cover the information and the content that you did. So thanks a million for your time. I think I just wanted to say thanks to the presenters, and thanks for everybody for tuning in, and hopefully people have some tips to take away with them for themselves or a family member or a friend, and just to stay well, I think, is what I'm going to finish on.
Thank you, Claire and Owen, for inviting us, and great to have met everybody tonight, and thank you for the questions. We're delighted to be involved.